Welcome to the lecture on World War II. Sorry I can't be with you all today, but this will have to suffice. This lecture will assume the knowledge from the last lecture, where we talked about the authoritarian regimes in Germany and Italy and in Japan. World War II, we're basically going to go kind of through a timeline just so you can understand events. The predominant causes of World War I were the expansionist fascist regimes in Germany and Italy, but also the expansionist authoritarian regime in Japan. These create two different theaters of war, one in Europe, driven by Italy and Germany, and the other in the Pacific, driven by Japan, though all three of those major aggressive expansionist powers formed the Axis alliance, which we'll talk about in a bit. Most people assume that the Allies were a little bit, in hindsight anyway, were a little bit harsh in the Treaty of Versailles, though there is some debate about that. Nonetheless, extremist groups like the Nazis were able to exploit the humiliation that Germany experienced and exploit the resentment that people had. And they did this in a time of chaos of the 1930s and Great Depression. They were able to use that to mobilize the country and gain political control. So the first major phase of the war is actually before the war started. In the European front, or in the European theater, we have Germany basically scrapping the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler comes to power in 1933, and by 1935 he is openly remilitarizing, which was against the treaty. He's also openly annexing territories around, as you see on this map. And so the Rhineland, which you see here, that is remilitarized, and then Austria is annexed, and this sets the stage for what Germany will do throughout World War II, and that is expand and annex these various territories. In this period of time, from 35 to 39, Germany outspent France and Britain by 6 times. And so Germany went from having very little in terms of military to becoming a superpower in terms of military. And so by the time that Germany invades Poland to really begin World War II in 1939, Germany is a military superpower, and it's already expanded a great deal into the areas immediately around it. So from 1936 to 1940, the Axis alliance forms. On your timeline, you can see the second and third item down, and then you can jump down to September 27th, 1940. Those are the 3 points that kind of really demonstrate the way in which Germany and Italy first signed treaties of cooperation from 1936 forward. They also were already working with Japan to some degree, and all of those powers are concerned to keep the Soviet Union under Stalin. They're trying to keep it also neutral. They're trying to keep it out of the business. And then the July 7th, 1937, you can see that Japan invades China. I'll talk about that in a moment, which initiates the Pacific theater of World War II. And then jumping back down on your World War II timeline to September 27th, 1940, that's when Germany, Italy, and Japan, who are the Axis alliance powers, sign a pact. The Pacific theater really started in earnest when Japan attacked China in 1937 and began its imperial expansion, not only in China and Korea, but also into Manchuria and the Soviet Union. So while Italy had expanded into Africa, especially Ethiopia, and other places in the Mediterranean, and Germany was expanding all around its territory, Japan was also expanding. And so all three of these authoritarian regimes begin these expansionist efforts in the last part of the 1930s, all of which lead to the beginning of World War II. World War II in the European theater began when Germany invaded Poland on September the 1st, 1939. Germany was able to invade Poland quickly, a tactic they called blitzkrieg, and they were also able to invade Poland without worrying about the Soviet Union retaliating, because the Germans and the Soviets had entered a pact in August of 1939, just before the invasion of Poland. In this pact, it was a non-aggression pact, in which Germany and the Soviet Union promised not to attack one another for 10 years. So Germany was able to invade Poland without worrying about the Soviets retaliating. In accordance with some secret provisions of that same pact, Poland and Germany would split, Germany and the Soviet Union would split Poland. So you can see here that Germany invades September 1st, and then the Soviet Union invades and occupies September 17th. This shortly after, actually just 2 days after Germany invaded Poland, that's when Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, as you can see on your timeline. This map shows you the partition and how the Soviets got the eastern half of Poland and the Germans got the western half. When the Germans invaded Poland, it was very brutal. There were 70,000 Poles who died in that attack, and about 1 million other Polish people were imprisoned. The Nazis divided their half of Poland into Western incorporated territories and then into the general government. And in the general government, this is where the horrific destruction took place. This is where the ghettoization of the Jews took place. Jews were put into these ghettos, and this is also where the death camps were eventually located. Over 500,000 Polish Jews. Over 500,000 Polish Jews died in the ghettos and the labor camps. The Nazis also created Jewish councils that organized life in these ghettos, and sometimes they forced these Jewish councils to fulfill Nazi tasks, which created these awful lose-lose situations for members of the councils. The Nazis also began their T4 program to murder people who had, quote, lives unworthy of living, according to the Nazis. And so they had to keep these things pretty quiet, because dealing out death to the disabled was not popular among the public. And so these programs were kept pretty secret, especially when the public reaction was not good very early on. And so a lot of the death and destruction and horrific institutions created by the Nazis were created in this particular area of Poland. This is just reminding you how things shifted from 39 to 40 when the Allies weren't expecting necessarily the Axis powers to blow up like they did in the 1930s. This shows you that in the 1930s, Germany already was a major military power. These figures demonstrate that, especially the artillery figure. I mean, Germany itself has more artillery than the Allies together, and that's significant considering especially that after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles basically, Germany almost had no military. And so this demonstrates how enormous production Hitler and the Nazis undertook in the 1930s to rearm and rearm quickly. This is what got especially Germany out of the Great Depression, just a ton of government spending to create a whole lot of weapons. So from 1939 to 1942, this is a period when the Axis powers invaded most of Europe. You can see here, this particular map is showing the German conquests throughout the Balkans, most of Central Europe, into France, all the way down to Spain, Scandinavia, and over into the Soviet Union. You can see here the major push of Germany into the Soviet Union. Key battles took place here in Stalingrad and in Moscow. Both of these would be key stops, Soviet stops of the German invasion. You can see here the yellow line. This is the farthest farthest that the German army advanced. And from here on out, after these key stops in 1942 and 1943, this is when you'll see this line move from here and just slowly but surely move toward Germany until eventually the end of the war, until that line is all the way in Berlin in Germany. And this is just another way to visualize what we were just looking at. You can see here the siege of Stalingrad from 42 to 43. You can see here the Germans were stopped here in 1941, and there was also in key battles in Leningrad as well. And you can see these purple lines where it's showing you the farthest advance of the German army, and then where the line ends up later. And so the Germans were here by 41, then here in 42, but then they get pushed back in here in 44, and then eventually in 45 the Russians will push the Germans all the way back to this line you see here. After the loss in at Stalingrad, the Nazis' propaganda office responded with this victory or Bolshevik chaos, which of course they were equating with Bolshevism being Russian or Soviet communism, and the Germans continued to, in their propaganda, illustrate communism with Jews, as you see here, tried to picture them as grotesque and poor and starving and in horror. All of these people are poor, starving, and in horror under these evil Jewish communists. So it's victory with the happy Germans trying to depict the Aryan, blonde hair, blue eye, tall and pale peoples over against a very dark and grotesque Bolshevism that would be horrible for everyone. So back to the Pacific theater. I was showing you earlier that Japan had invaded China and Korea by they attacked China in 1937 and continued to expand in these areas to advance their interests for protection and sometimes brutal expansion. For instance, the rape of Nanjing, which you see Nanjing there on the Chinese map, and other atrocities as well. So it's a brutal type of expansion, and then they decide to keep going. They keep expanding into the Pacific area and the South China Sea area, where Western European industrial powers had major holdings. You can see here on the map both the Netherlands and the United States and Great Britain. All three of these folks, and the French also had areas here as well. So industrial Western powers had key holdings here, and the Japanese began to take them over. And so in 1941, July of 1941, the United States and the United Kingdom imposed some pretty severe economic sanctions on Japan. They culminated with an embargo on oil exports to Japan, when Japan relied for 80% of its oil relied on the United States. So, but this did not stop Japan. They continued to be aggressively expansionist. And so you can see here in the 1941 and 42 offensives, Japan continued to attack with great speed and with great efficiency, and they continued to surprise their opponents. And so the Allied powers experienced a lot of embarrassing defeats in the first 6 months of the war. Most notably would be for the United States, in United States memory, was Pearl Harbor, which you see here on the far east side of the map. And you can see the sphere of influence that Japan had by 1942 that's outlined in the red here. Basically, the entire Pacific area they had conquered or practiced an enormous amount of influence through alliances. And one of the things that the Japanese did was style themselves as the liberators. Liberators, so they would go to these places in the Netherlands and Indochina, Thailand, the Philippines, all these places that were ruled by Western powers, these Western imperial colonial powers, and Japan styled themselves as liberators. But in reality, what actually happened was Japan ruled these places with an iron fist, and they engaged in some serious atrocities against native populations and also against European prisoners of war. And so, while they styled themselves one way, most people did not experience a high quality of life during Japanese occupation. And so you can see here what happens is, especially after Pearl Harbor, which let me show you a picture here. Here you can see Pearl Harbor, where a number of the ships were either damaged or sunk. This is also a place where you could go ahead and pause the video, and there's about a minute long newsreel clip from back in the day of the announcement of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So after Pearl Harbor, which you can see here on this map, after Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan and officially entered World War II. And you can see here on this map, the green arrows are the Allied advance into the various islands and places that the Japanese had taken over in their 1941 and 1942 era of expansion. And a lot of these places the Japanese had dug in because they really did want to make an impenetrable defensive barrier, defensive perimeter against the Allied powers. And so, a lot of these places were very, very hard won by the Allies, as you no doubt are aware of some of the major battles you see listed here: Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and of course, eventually to end the war, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, which you see represented on this map, and maps usually with the mushroom cloud that is created by the atomic bombs. And so this is coming back again to visualize weapons production as the major offensives happened from the 1939 through 1942 from the Allied power, or from the Axis powers. You can see the Allied powers really kick it into gear in making artillery and tanks and warships and aircraft. And by the 41-42 era here, far outweigh the Axis powers in terms of just sheer weapons production. This is when Rosie the Riveter, the women are making lots of weapons while the men go off to war. Here is just another visualization of the Allied advance in the Pacific theater, and the various places and islands and the dates you see listed here of battles and when the Allied powers captured and went on offensives. And then back to the European theater, you can see here just a visualization of the Russian counterattack and the defeat eventually of Nazi Germany, as not just Russia moves west to Germany. Also, the other Allied powers come in, as you see up in France, the famous battle D-Day, and they come and push up through Italy, conquering those areas, up through the Balkans and across France until eventually Germany is completely cornered. One of the things that World War II became known for was the either blurred line or sometimes non-existent line between soldiers and civilians. This was most apparent in the bombing of cities to destroy cities and infrastructure, but also just wipe out massive numbers of people. This was practiced in Germany, especially in the Battle of Britain, as you see on this map, where Germany continued to launch air raids in hopes of making Britain sue for peace, and Britain hunkered down and maintained. So it didn't work. But the Allies also engaged in this tactic of bombing cities through a number of methods: traditional bombing, but also fire bombing. This was where armies would planes would drop these fire bombs, a bunch of them at a time. They would just burn really hot and just incinerate large numbers of people, entire city blocks. This is an image of Dresden after a bombing. You can just see basically things are just rubble. Some scholars believe that this bombing killed as many as the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The major storyline for the end of World War II in the Pacific theater was the United States' decision to drop the atomic bombs, to use nuclear weapons. So in the Pacific theater, Japan had dug in, and as you can see, the Allied advance was the tactic was island hopping across the Pacific to take back island by island until they could get to the mainland and fight Japan eventually to surrender. Of course, there were also the Soviet Union was coming in from the north, as you can see, and invading Manchuria in 1945, taking those areas. The problem about island hopping was it was extraordinarily expensive in Allied lives. For instance, two of the major battles toward the end, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, historians believe that these really factored into the president's decision to use the atomic bombs. Just to take the one example of Okinawa, which was fought from April to June, the American casualties there were over 70,000. There were 14,000 Americans killed and 57,000 wounded. And historians believe this played really, really decisive influence on Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan, because he and others are doing calculations of how many American soldiers and Allied soldiers' lives will it take to make Japan surrender. Japan was going to lose at this point. The Allied powers had destroyed the Axis powers. They were backed everybody into a corner in Europe, and so here Japan is on an island. But the thing is, they were dug in and ready to fight to the end, and so it was going to cost a lot more American lives. And so estimates for how many died in the atomic bombs, something like 100,000 or so each, perhaps less, perhaps more. But in the figures that they were running, that helped them determine, well, you know what, we're not going to give that many or twice that many or however many more Allied lives. And so while it's easy to look back, I think, in judgment like, wow, I can't believe that people would bomb cities, all sides no one was innocent. A lot of people were guilty, and to the people that had to run these numbers in the midst of war, it seemed to make sense that this was the less costly alternative for one particular side. So shortly after the Battle of Okinawa, actually just a month, that's when the Manhattan Project, this group of scientists that were testing the atomic bomb, they tested it in New Mexico, and when they did, it sent a cloud of debris 8 miles into the air, and that same type of cloud was hanging over Japan just a month after that first testing in New Mexico. Atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and a picture right after the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima is you see here. And then August 9th, another one was dropped on Nagasaki. Historians think probably something like Hiroshima on August 6th probably incinerated something like 100,000 people right away, and probably as many or nearly as many in Nagasaki when the second bomb was dropped on August 9th. It took the emperor very little time, less than a week, before Emperor Hirohito said that Japan surrendered. Here you see the only building near the atomic bomb's hypocenter that was partially intact after the bomb. This would probably be a good place to go ahead and pause the video and go watch the history.com video that I have listed in the email. Today, that industrial promotion hall, they left it as it was, and it is part of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, which is a tribute to remember the victims, but also a reminder to all about the horrors of nuclear weapons. This is the first place to experience nuclear weapons, and also to promote world peace. That and other parks with similar motives in Hiroshima attract about 1 million visitors every year. And so the Pacific Theater came to a close in August of 1945 after the major brutal attacks with nuclear weapons. Here's an image of the mushroom cloud that was created from the bomb in Nagasaki, and you can see that it stretched 11 miles into the atmosphere. So the three major powers met secretly in Yalta in February of 1945. So you see Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin here, and they're mainly trying to figure out how on earth to run post-war Europe. And so they make a number of different agreements about how to divide up countries and things like that. Major death toll was 60 million, around 60 million. Over half of those were civilians. The Soviet Union lost the largest number with 26 million people, and of course the legacy of the Holocaust, which was what we call now genocide. This is the attempt to wipe out an entire group of people based on race or ethnicity. The Cold War and the nuclear arms race was another major effect of the World War II, and it was a long-term one. The Cold War lasted for nearly 50 years after World War II was over. You can see here on the map that the Cold War crisis areas all over the world, there were conflicts over this major fundamental division in the world after World War II, and that was large and powerful communist nation wanting people to go communist and nations to go communist, and large and powerful democratic nations wanting the world to go in a democratic way. And so any place where the interests were especially important for either side, or especially for both sides, folks showed up there, and there were oftentimes war. Like the Vietnam War is probably the most infamous of the Cold War conflicts. The U.S. also became a leader in rebuilding liberal democratic Europe. Post-colonialism was another effect of the end of World War II, as the major nations in Europe, the major colonial powers, were severely weakened. That contributed to ending colonialism, but also the imperialistic type of colonialism that started World War II really put a hit on the ideology of colonialism. And so slowly but surely after World War II, colonies gained their independence. And this is where nationalism and people wanting independence and wanting to become nations merged with the decrease in power of major colonial nations, but also just sort of the demotion of this idea of colonialism, to the point where today, like I've mentioned before, colonialism is pretty much like a cuss word in international politics. And finally, growing internationalism and cooperation among nations was a major effect of World War II. So we've been talking for a while about how nationalism, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, could create this desire for imperialism, and a lot of people believed that nations were inherently expansionist, and so this is a shift away from that idea and more and toward the idea that you all probably grew up with, which is that nations ought to be in cooperation, that nations ought to work together for the good of other nations. It's a much more peaceful way to go about things. Though there continue to be wars because nations can't always cooperate. In this particular environment, it would be hard to imagine it's hard to imagine anything like World War I or World War II, where the massive alliance systems happened which led to these major wars. Today, the internationalism I'm talking about here would be the United Nations, World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. All of those things were immediate after World War II, 1945, and after. And those have grown into other things like the European Union and other types of cooperative groups where nations try to work together for the interests of all nations. And so, obviously, it's not a perfect system, but it is a system that has developed and emerged out of World War I and World War II. And that concludes a very short introduction to World War II and its effects.